Okay, so the first part of the lecture, I'll go through 3 ideas. It's a very, very basic general introduction to what social neuroscience is. But then also thinking about this term that is often kind of bandied about, the social brain. What does that really mean, and how does it differ from the rest of the brain? And this isn't something I'm going to answer in this lecture. It's something that I may get close to answering in the 11-12 lectures, that we get. And then the other one is kind of a bit more of a debate. So is neuroscience an appropriate level of explanation for studying social behaviour? So you come from different backgrounds. So approximately half of you are from the social psychology masters and half from a cognitive neuroscience. So it's an interesting kind of mix of people, and hopefully we'll get some interesting views on this subject. So of course, within our brains, we've got a firing of neurons and so on, and neurons are connected with each other both in terms of by virtue of being next to each other, that they can communicate via synapses, but they can also communicate at a distance via synaptic connections in axons. So within our brain, our neurons capable of communicating with each other through structural properties of the brain. The thing that's really interesting about social neuroscience is that you've kind of got the same thing happening just via social interactions. So in a way, it's almost as if you've got a mega brain, in that activity in one region of my brain can affect activity in one region of your brain just by virtue of a shared understanding or a shared kind of social interaction, or me pulling a frowning face will trigger activity in your brain. And that isn't to do with structural connections, it's to do with you being able to interpret what my face is saying and what the meaning of my face is, for instance. So, for instance, this is just one example. It doesn't really matter about what the details of the study is. I will go through it. But basically, it's kind of an economic interaction between two people in which one person is deciding how much money to give to that person, and then they're deciding how much money to get back. And in some cases, you can decide not to give that any money and to steal it. In other cases, you can be generous and build up this kind of cooperation. What you have here, though, are two people lying in MRI scanners in different rooms, as it happens, but that doesn't matter. But they're having here a social interaction via computer screens. So it's kind of virtual social interaction, but they're real humans, real brains, doing something that is of interest. And the kind of thing that you find here, so this is within this person called the trustee, the person who's investing money in the other player, that you've got some regions that kind of connect with each other. So when this region becomes active, maybe the other region becomes active as well. And this is obviously done by virtue of the fact that there are structural connections between these in this person's brain. The really kind of, interesting thing is that when this part of this person's brain becomes active, the other part of the other person's brain becomes active in sync. So as the other person makes a decision to give money, the other person's brain is kind of anticipating the reward and it responds accordingly. So it's almost as if you've got these two brains kind of in sync and coordinating. So it's a very kind of interesting idea that you can have this. So this is kind of stepping back from that kind of example. This is a kind of more formal definition. So an attempt to understand and explain, using the methods and theories of neuroscience, how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviours of individuals are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. So again, here the social interactions can be just thinking about others' intentions and so on. It opens up, computer games, the internet, and so on. Facebooking is social interaction, searching on Google isn't, and that's only because in your mind you're assuming that there's another human at the end of Facebook, but not in the case of Google, for instance. But this definition actually is, comes from the 1950s to do with social psychology, and all I've done is inserted these words here. So this is a standard definition of social psychology with a bit of neuroscience thrown in. And to some extent, that's what social neuroscience is. And it is kind of modern, although you could argue it's been around before that, but without this kind of labelling. So really the kind of labelling and the idea of this being a coherent discipline started to emerge about 2000, where you've, later than that, about this period, you've actually got journals that start using this name. But before that, you've got some key review papers that call it social neuroscience or social cognitive neuroscience. Of course, before that, it wasn't, a complete dearth of research. So research on the emotions, for instance, has a very long history in the neurosciences, just as it has in social psychology and other disciplines, but it just didn't have this kind of labeling or this way of thinking about it. Similarly, face perception, the classic model of face perception came from the 1980s. But people used to think of faces more in terms of visual objects rather than in terms of social objects. And that's kind of been a bit of a shift. But the idea of kind of understanding faces, recognizing expressions and so on has a very long history. So social neuroscience has lots of kind of historical forerunners, but the idea of it coming together as a discipline has really only come about then. And it's tended to kind of attract people more from the neuroscience background rather than the social psychology background. There's absolutely no reason why that should be, except that the methods that are used tend to be more from having a methodological background in cognitive neuroscience. But actually, you'll see how the two methods kind of merge. So what is the social brain, this term that's kind of bandied about? So there are various ways in which we can think about that. So you should be familiar with this term modules or modularity. And this is the basic idea that we can divide cognition into different kinds of processes. And one particular idea popularized by Fodor is that some of these processes in the brain might be specialized for processing only particular kinds of information, and that this is kind of efficient computationally and evolutionary, because if you want to change something, you can change one part of the system without changing the whole thing. So the idea of domain specificity is seen as being one property of a module, and that's the idea that you've got some processes that process only one kind of information. So here, the claim might be that you've got neurons or regions of the brain that process social information, but not non-social information. Of course, here, then you've got the thorny thing is how you define what's social and what's non-social. I've kind of given you a bit of a working definition, but it's not straightforward. Again, some people would argue that the one definition or one kind of baggage of module is that they're kind of innate. That doesn't mean that they're present at birth. It means that they've kind of been shaped by evolution. You might need some environment with them as well. So you could say that speaking's innate, but that doesn't mean that infants know how to speak from birth. They still need to be kind of, acculturated. And you could argue that some social abilities are like this. So again, there's various things that have come out of the literature, some of which are more convincing than others. So there might be modules for recognizing faces. You might want to think of that as being social. Others about kind of attributing mental states to other people. So a general tendency to think about other people's behaviors in terms of their thoughts rather than in terms of the mechanical movements of their bodies and so on. So this is kind of the idea of theory of mind as a module, if you're used to that. Other examples, which I don't think are quite so convincing, but some evolutionary psychologists have said that there are modules in the brain for detecting cheating and things like this. So that's one view. Another view is kind of a non-specialized view. This is kind of the polar opposite, if you will. That basically the idea that social cognition is just linked to general cognitive capacities. So what, for instance, we as humans have done is we've learned to be very intelligent, but we're just as intelligent in both the social domain as we are in the non-social domain. Okay? And the advantages have arisen equally with both of those, or gone hand in hand. And again, there are some leading proponents about this. So one of the things I'll talk about in the lecture next week is the idea about why is it that some species have bigger brains. So one claim is that actually the reason why we've developed bigger brains is actually to outwit each other, to be socially smarter, but actually our general intelligence or non-social intelligence has happened hand in hand. Another kind of idea along this, so this is the famous evolutionary guy, Stephen Jay Gould, has kind of effectively argued that all we've had is kind of an evolutionary arms race to develop bigger brains, and it's nothing about being more social, would be his claim, and being able to kind of understand each other is a byproduct of that. But he's kind of arguing against the idea that evolution has shaped certain modules and circuits in the brains. What it's done is effectively led to this arms race of bigger brains all the time. And obviously there are other constraints, so how big a head you can give birth to and all the rest. So it's not just about intelligence. So there are other kinds of information processes that are kind of hybrid positions. So this is an interesting kind of theoretical paper by Jason Mitchell in Trends in Cognitive Sciences, where he's kind of argued that basically that you haven't got something that's modular, but you've got some regions that seem to be more specialized for social information. And he says they're kind of more specialized for social information in the sense that social information is kind of more unpredictable. He uses the term fuzzy, which I'm not sure is the right term, because it kind of implies, what does fuzzy mean? But basically that it's kind of less stable, less definite. It's about kind of entertaining multiple possibilities and so on, or kind of disconnecting from reality, in effect, might be one way to think about it. So here you've actually got things that serve social information processing better than non-social information processing, but might not strictly fall in that dichotomy. So again, he talks about this one region of the brain. I won't go into it in detail, but the idea that this is involved in a whole host of functions. So if you were to go through your kind of social psychology textbook from 20 years ago, this part of the brain is kind of involved in all of that, but it doesn't seem to be involved so much in kind of language or face perception and so on. But it's involved in things like kind of, understanding each other's personality traits. It's involved in kind of, attributions of persuasion, this kind of thing. It's involved in pretty much every chapter of your social psychology textbook, but it's not so much involved in any of your chapters in your undergraduate cognitive psychology textbook. But what is it doing? What is its function? That's the kind of the key debate. So this is kind of a semi kind of modular view. And another kind of system that it isn't clear whether it's purely social or non-social is this thing called mirror systems, which we'll cover a lot in the lectures. What a mirror system is basically they were discovered in macaque monkeys. And they were discovered for essentially something that on the face of it is not very social. And basically what you would have is that if the monkey reaches for an object like this, the neuron would fire. Okay? So this is a neuron that responds to actions. And this is what you can see here. So here this is just action potential. So electrical activity of individual neurons in the brain firing over time as the animal reaches towards an object. The thing about these neurons is that they kind of show a similar response. Here it's kind of spread out a bit more time if the experimenter goes and does the same action. So here you've got a neuron that's responding both when the animal does something and when somebody else does something. Is that social or not? Well, the key thing about it is that it's doing something irrespective of whether you are doing it or whether somebody else is doing it. Whether that actually helps you to understand another person and so on isn't necessarily clear. But this has kind of led to a bit of a revolution, and some people say that these might be, for instance, a social mechanism, something that we have in the brain that is there for social reasons, that was kind of evolved to serve these kinds of functions, but might be used in other contexts as well. And you might have similar systems for things like pain as well as action. So in other parts of the brain, there are neurons that respond if you have a painful injection, for instance, but if you see somebody else having a painful injection. Does that enable you to empathize and so on? These are the kinds of debates. And is that strictly social if you've got something that responds to you and something else? Would we say that that beats that definition? Okay. And of course, you can have a mixed model as well, a kind of mixed economy, that within what we might want to call the social brain, you've got some things that are very specialized, might have been put in there kind of millions of years ago, might exist in primates, and then other things that we might use in social ways. So, for instance, maybe reasoning might be part of our general intelligence, but we can apply it to reasoning about what you're thinking about me, thinking about him, in the same way as we can apply it to any kinds of tests of general intelligence. So it's not the case of it being one or the other. And this seems like, the best kind of example at the moment, but we'll see, and I'm interested in your thoughts. So before I can move on, any kind of points about this, we will... I think one of the other kind of critiques, which I've seen articulated a little bit, so I'm kind of waiting for the devastating critique of social neuroscience that I will be giving out in this lecture. I've not really found it yet. But you see some certainly general healthy skepticism that really, in order to understand social processes, we need to understand social behaviour at this kind of level, and that there isn't really much to be gained by studying it at that level, that you'll only understand social behaviour by studying the interactions of individuals and groups and between groups, and that going within the individual and their brains isn't going to give you new insights. And I'll present you with some evidence for and against that. So here the question is how you can bridge this divide between neuroscience, which is interested in things from chemicals up to neural circuits, and social psychology, which is interested in individual and group interactions, in effect. And of course, the two things, have to connect at some level, but I guess an interesting thing is, do they connect in any kind of non-trivial way? So a trivial way in which they could connect, which I'll talk about as kind of being more of a blank slate idea, is the idea that all your brain is doing is kind of storing social knowledge, in effect. So, we all live in different cultures, but the brain, all it does is just it kind of stores as learnt associations what has been there in the environment. It doesn't actually change anything in our kind of cultural or social environment itself. It's just a bit of a sponge. So here, clearly, the brain is important for facilitating our social interactions, but the directionality is going from culture downwards, or from social interactions downwards. If you meet someone, it might affect their neural circuits, but do your neural circuits make you mean? Can you go from the bottom up? So, in a way, there is no controversy that these interact. The real controversy, insofar as there is any, is it coming from the bottom up as well as from the top down? In effect, I think we can take it for granted that that our environments shape and affect our brains. But so if we take something like prejudice, for instance, you might kind of wonder, can you really understand prejudice by looking in the brain? Now, clearly at a superficial level, you might be able to do that. You might be able to show, for instance, that when a white person sees a black person's face, they respond differently than when they see somebody of their own race or an out race. But does that really help you to explain prejudice, or does it just tell you, well, actually, mechanisms of prejudice are in the brain? It's like, well, where else would they be if not in the brain? Because your brain is the repository of social knowledge in the way it is every other kind of knowledge. So you could kind of argue, well, in order to understand prejudice, you need to understand, the history of slavery and, why one group takes advantage of another group and so on. And, you're not going to find it by looking at the brain. And of course, there is some truth in that. And I think, again, here, one of the problems that some people have with social neuroscience is the idea that an explanation of prejudice is going to occur at this level and not in the interaction between these levels. So I think it's right to say that to understand prejudice, we kind of have to understand the social and cultural context. But I don't see that that's going to go away. The question is, can we learn anything new by studying at that level? It doesn't mean that you're going to replace those kinds of socio-historical, cultural things. It just means that whatever is happening in the brain will sit alongside that. So again, the kind of things that you might want to look at here is, do we empathise with everybody? Are there good reasons why we choose to empathise with some people and not? And that maybe this adapts. So things like stereotyping would be the classic kind of example here, where stereotyping is seen as being a good property of nervous systems computationally, to be able to simplify information and to be able to kind of make judgments about new people. doesn't mean to say that prejudice is a good thing, but it might kind of relate to very basic ways in which the brain is structured, in which society kind of feeds on that in a negative way by creating these kinds of groups. So I think it might be naive to say that we don't get anything from studying from that direction up as well. There is, again, so there are kind of questions how we link levels of explanation as well, how we kind of make this, these kinds of bridging. So again, one of the issues here that we'll kind of come back to in other lectures would be, for instance, if we take the example of race, one typical finding in the literature is that white American students, when they see a black face, will activate their amygdala, but will not do so when they see a white face. So there's a whole kind of history in the neuroscience literature of the amygdala being linked to fear and fear conditioning, so the work of Joe Ledoux and so on. So one might claim that this proves that white people have a kind of a brain-based fear reaction to seeing a racial outgroup. That might be the case, but it might not be. It kind of depends on your assumptions as to what the amygdala is and how it functions. So this guy here, Poldrack, has said that one problem for social neuroscience, as it is for much every other aspect of cognitive neuroscience, is this problem of reverse inference. But we can get information about the brain, but what do we do with it? Okay? How do we interpret it, other than saying, yeah, this region responds to that and this region responds to the other? How do we interpret it meaningfully? And of course, it depends on what baggage you bring to that. If you think the amygdala is the fear center of the brain, you will interpret that piece of evidence very differently than in other ways. So he calls this reverse inference, the idea that you might use different pieces of information from the brain in order to kind of adjudicate between them. And sometimes that's a valid thing to do, but it's also fraught with problems. So again, another example that we'll go through in another lecture is morality to do with, or moral judgments to do with reasoning, or are they to do with emotion? Okay? Now, if you've got a set of brain regions which you know to be linked to emotion, a set of brain regions known to be linked to reasoning, you can effectively try to address that question. But of course, the answer you get is only as good as the evidence base you put in there. And of course, then you've got this kind of circularity problem as to how you deal with that. So it's not straightforward linking these kind of levels of explanation together. It's a challenge. And I think that the other challenge is that, of course, the levels of explanation are linked, but what's the cause and what's the effect? So again, here, it must be the case that our kind of environment and our society affects the way that our brain functions, but does it go the other way around as well? Does the way that our brain is kind of wired affect the kind of society that we create? So there's some evidence for this. So in the next lecture next week, I'll talk about some evidence that the actual size of our brain that varies primarily across species rather than within species affects how many friendships we can have. Okay? Whether or not you find it convincing, I don't know, but there is something to be accounted for here with this. Again, things like whether or not a species tends to be social or kind of live in family groups, or whether they just come together to mate and then disappear. This seems to relate to the presence of particular receptors in the brain. Probably I can count them on the fingers of my hand, the number of receptors that determine whether you're a monogamous species or a non-monogamous species. Which doesn't mean whether or not you cheat on your husband or not. It's not that kind of monogamy, whether or not you kind of, as a species, kind of engage in that behaviour. Okay? So we're probably not just kind of working family units because society tells us to do. We may do it because our neurobiology tells us to do that. Okay? And again, it might be the case, and I'll present some evidence for this, that things like imitation in humans is seen as being rewarding or intrinsically rewarding, whereas other animals, they seem to be able to imitate, but they don't do it as a reward in itself in the way that, for instance, infants do. They seem to find imitation rewarding, whereas other species, whether infants or adults, you could train them to imitate, but they don't seem to get the point is that something that's, again, a very basic thing that, ultimately kind of reveals itself in the fact how we wear our hair, the fashion we wear, and so on, this kind of desire to conform, to imitate, to be like one another. Okay. So let me give you an example of linking levels of explanation. So what about aggression? So again, here, when I looked into the Hogg and Vaughan textbook, one of the things it says here is that societies differ hugely in terms of the amount of kind of murders and violence and so on that they've got. So what they were wanting to do is say aggression therefore must have its origins or must be understood in terms of the processing of different cultures and societies. Okay? That's fine. But what I would kind of say, coming from a biological angle, is that actually within each and every one of those societies, I suspect that the kinds of situations in which violence erupts is similar. And I bet that the anger of the emotion of anger and frustration is involved in each of those different cultures. And these kinds of mechanisms you would certainly see in other animals and so on. So I don't think we can use the fact that the level of aggression varies a lot between societies as evidence against biology. Clearly there's something happening at the societal level, but it's not evidence that biology isn't important, okay? So again, here, the example that I give there is how many fingers do we have in our hand? So 5, okay? If I ask you what causes the variability in the number of fingers on our hand, it's pretty much all environmental. And the reason being is that people put their fingers in machines, they have horrible accidents and so on. It's quite, the thing that drives variability in the number of fingers is all environmental. The thing that makes you have 5 fingers is pretty much all biological. Now, you could plausibly make the same argument here. The thing that creates aggression is kind of these mechanisms to do with anger, protecting resources, and so on. The thing that causes variability in aggression might be at the societal level. So some societies, for instance, would think it's acceptable, if somebody calls your wife a whore, to go and punch them or kick them or shoot them, okay? Some societies would have that as an acceptable response. Others would send you to prison or have other draconian means. So in a way, society can kind of take the lid off these kinds of mechanisms. It can squash it by having norms as to how we behave to each other and so on. But I suspect it's... But the fact that certain norm violations are the things that trigger the aggression, I suspect, is quite independent of culture. But we can debate that. So again, here, this is an interesting kind of empirical example here. That, for instance, there is kind of a whole debate as to whether testosterone levels in men kind of predict aggressive tendencies. The evidence on whole says yes. But actually, the effect is much greater in men of a low socioeconomic status than it is in men of a high socioeconomic status. And again, here it might be, well, if you're high status, you haven't got to use physical aggression in order to get your resources and what you want. You've already made it, in effect. Whereas in low SES, it's almost as if your biology comes more to the fore. Whereas in high SES, you don't need your biology because you've got your culture or your society has given you everything you could possibly want, at some level. Okay? So again, you've got that kind of interesting dialogue between these different levels of explanation. So what about culture itself? So again, here we have to think about the existence of culture plus variabilities in culture. So what I would say is that the fact that culture exists at all probably has some basis in biology, okay? In the sense that, not every species has all this stuff around us, all these, material culture, what we dress, what we wear, the way we process food and so on. This is to do with the fact that we have the mental ability to create all this, okay? What is perhaps less dependent on biology, although we'll talk about that, is variations in culture. That might be more just to do with history and chances or different kinds of environments. So, living in a desert versus living in somewhere that's fertile might lead to certain kinds of cultural niches emerging. But that isn't really biology, okay? With that. But other people have kind of argued, so this is Mark Hauser. How many people have heard of him? So it's worth Googling because he's a disgraced Harvard academic, basically, who got caught out for making up some of his data. But aside from doing that, he generates some really good kind of theoretical and conceptual ideas that will kind of outlive his shame. But one of the ideas that he kind of has is what he calls the possibility of impossible cultures. So again here, just as with the kind of levels of different violence with them, we're so impressed by that we kind of think that the level of explanation must be at the social or the cultural level. And similarly, we're so impressed by the diversity of cultures that we kind of assume that diversity can't possibly be biological. But what he says that there might be some cultures which just are not biologically possible. Unfortunately, he doesn't give many kind of clear examples as to what these might be in there. So this is kind of one of my own that I kind of try to make up, which I'm not sure whether it works or not. But again, so for instance, slavery would be a possible culture. It's not something that we would necessarily endorse or feel comfortable with, but slave societies have historically been successful potentially over millennia. So it is a possible human culture. But again, would it be possible to have a slave kind of human culture in which you've got positive feelings to the outgroup, or do you always have to dehumanize and so on? So it might be that slave cultures are a possible culture, but only if you've got a kind of a dehumanizing kind of mindset. Okay, that would be one example of this. Could you have a slave culture in which you don't have a dehumanizing mindset? Would that constitute an impossible culture? That it could arise, but then it would just die off, in the way that you might have certain biological forms that arise, but they just die off because they're not compatible with the way that the cognitive systems work. Okay. Right, so this will hopefully got you thinking a little bit. So this is a really kind of interesting example of how these different levels of explanation can interact. And here we're talking about things right down at the bottom of the neuroscience chain, at the level of kind of individual differences in DNA, going right up to the top of the chain in terms of how different cultures function. So Way and Lieberman in their paper said, is there a genetic contribution to cultural differences? And they talk about, so here they're interested particularly in the differences between individualism and collectivism. So individualism is the predominant mindset in the West, and it's about seeing yourself as being an independent entity with your kind of own goals and aspirations, that eventually you'll form your own ideas and leave home and so on. Whereas collectivism is more about your interrelation with other group members, particularly your family, your in-group, and you kind of define yourself more in terms of your obligation and your commitments to these people, and in terms of sharing, your identity is kind of shared with them as a group in effect. So they're kind of asking the question, to what extent is that just due to kind of individual chance differences, or to what extent are genes contributing to the fact that some societies may adopt a collectivist stance and others an individualistic stance? Okay. So one gene that they look at is this serotonin transporter gene that has two variants. So basically what gene variants are, in effect, they're just kind of naturally occurring differences. So they're kind of mutations, but they're mutations that we would all have. So within this room, there will be some people with short alleles and some with long alleles. Okay, so they're just different versions of the same gene. Because you get you've got a pair of genes, one from your father and one from your mother, that you will either be short, which means you've got a short gene from both of your parents, long, which means you've got a long gene from both your parents, or short, which means you've got one from each other. So in all these cases, you've always got two genes, and you can have either a mix or one or the other. Whether or not the mix makes you more like one or the other is kind of a matter of debate. What we know is that this short gene is seen as being what they call socially sensitive. So it's linked, if you have this short gene and you experience negative life events, it makes you more vulnerable to depression, suicide, anxiety. It's linked to kind of a broad range of mental health problems, really. What's also interesting is that if you have a short carrier, if you've got these short genes in your serotonin transporter, it can also make you have less depression following a positive life event. So it's almost as if you're super sensitive both to bad things happening and to good things happening as well in your life. So, for instance, if you have the short allele and you're depressed, but then good things start to happen to you, you bounce back faster than somebody who's depressed with a long allele. So it's kind of it conveys a vulnerability both in the traditional negative sense, but also in a positive sense. The interesting thing about that is that the short allele is far more prevalent in collectivist cultures, and these kind of reverse here. So these people here have more short allele, and here this is to do with the amount of collectivism. So how you assess this, there are various things. So either individual questionnaires or other kinds of metric, which I won't go into. But you have the strong correlation there. So the East Asian ones here come out quite strongly there. So again, and these are the more kind of individualistic cultures there. So I'm sure you can think of other explanations, and we'll come to those. But it's certainly not just that gene. There are other genes that convey social susceptibility. Now, these go the other way, and that's just simply because in this one, collectivism is at the top, and here, collectivism is at the bottom. They just scored it differently in these two papers, and I couldn't see a way of doing it without turning my graph upside down. But you've just got to believe me that they go in the same direction. So this is the mu opioid gene, which has two versions, G and A, instead of short and long. It doesn't really matter what it is. But those who are the G carriers are more socially sensitive. So on questionnaire measures, they say that they feel a lot more hurt by the thought of social rejection. And there are some kind of experimental paradigms, which I'll show you in another lecture, where you're kind of throwing balls to each other, then all of a sudden people stop throwing balls to you. And these people are also more sensitive to that kind of game. You can show that their brain responds differently when people stop playing with them in this kind of paradigm. But again, people in collectivist cultures are more likely to have this social sensitivity gene. And then this one here is monoamine oxidase A, which is involved in breaking down various neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, and so on. So less evidence here. But again, you've got this trend that linking social sensitivity more to collectivist cultures. So what is going on here? So on the face of it, it could well be that that differences in the gene pool here are selecting differences in the culture. The general kind of way of thinking about this is what's termed gene-culture co-evolution, which is the idea that you've kind of got both happening at the same time. So you might have some random mutations that occur, and then over many millennia, what happens is that the society also changes, and then the gene pool also changes to be more consistent with that. So in the same way as, other animals might kind of, shrink their tails or something like this, it doesn't just happen overnight. It's that they find themselves in an environment where the tail is less useful, and eventually, it will kind of shrink or wither. That's the kind of explanation. So it's not that all of a sudden that having these genes creates the culture overnight. It's more the case that you've got this constant kind of selection pressures, both from the top down to you may become more or less collectivist and so on. That's the kind of framework here between them. And over the last few years, this word didn't appear in my textbook because I don't think it was around when I wrote it. So this is kind of how it is. There's this term cultural neuroscience, which you might like, but some people who study cultural psychology tend not to like, because again, you're just kind of adding neuroscience on the end of something and getting some baggage. But the idea here is that it's an interdisciplinary field bridging cultural psychology, neurosciences, and neurogenetics that explains how neurobiological processes such as genetic expression and brain function gives rise to cultural values, practices, and beliefs, as well as how culture shapes neurobiological processes across macro and micro timescales. So again, it's emphasizing both the bottom-up and top-down kind of influence of these two here. So here's a kind of a nice quote of somebody who doesn't like cultural neuroscience. So putting subjects from the United States and China in an MR tomograph and scanning their brains while they are performing a set of specialized tasks is not exactly what most people would regard as a promising way of unpacking the complexities of culture. Okay, so this is kind of a kind of no, don't be lured by this. Okay. So what I'd like you to do is tell me what you think about this. So I'd like you to talk in twos and threes